crab boats in the Bering Sea finally have a good harvest. The average crab in a cage weighs 300 pounds, but much of it is for crew or an ankle injury. The captain gives him a twist and he keeps going. Heavy due to overwork. Just lie on the ground like this. The captain will give him 10,000 taels of gold. This is in the off-season. The crew would have to fly right where they are. The storyline of this episode follows the end of the previous episode. Since the crew of the Pat fell to the ground, the crew shouted for 3 or 4 minutes. The fallen crew members are unresponsive. Carl up there heard what was going on over the radio. I thought another crew member was dead, but this time the wounded man woke up soon enough. But when I woke up, I was still confused. Then the crew explained to him what had happened. The wounded were then helped back by the crew. Carl got down as soon as he got back. And then you start measuring blood sugar and stuff. Go up and contact the doctor when you're done. Devin is Carl's new crew member in the last video. Even he was baffled by his own accident. Carl from above also contacted the doctor at this time. The doctor said the crewman might have hypoglycemia. That combined with long working hours leads to low blood sugar. Another possibility is heart disease. Carl's heart wrenched again when he heard this. He said he was in touch with a doctor in 4 hours. Later in the day, the wounded Devin rested in his cabin. The rest of the crew went on deck to continue their work. 380 miles northeast of the Mary. They dropped a batch of exploration cages last night. The Salvage is now ready to begin. It's also the first crab cage of 2021. As the Salvage mission begins, they don't have much snow crab quota this time. It's like filling a red king crab's financial hole. Apparently, the first crab pot has no feathers, but Casey was used to it. After all, none of their test cages ever worked. And then the second cage. When I pulled it up, there wasn't even a hair. Casey up there looks at the broken crop and started laughing at Josh's great choice of place. Faced with the dilemma of not catching crabs, they both thought of asking for help. I'd like to call the brothers the help seekers. The view then moves to Thief. They're still fishing for golden king crabs. But these 2 days, the harvest is pretty weak. Nathan was there before he could say anything on the radio. Josh can't even close at this time. Just ask Nathan if there's a location for the snow crab. There's no question about this one. When Josh heard that, it was the ultimate facelift. Then Casey said he knew someone else. The view then moves to the Witcher. And they don't have a good harvest here either. Then Keith got the call. Josh was smart this time. Bobo almost said he wanted to work with Keith. But because of the reputation of these two, basically, working with those two would be ruined. So Keith wasn't too happy about it. But I can't afford to look at my harvest. Plus the entreaties from both of them. Keith reluctantly agreed. Keith then shared his situation with them and where you're going next, and have them explore it ahead of time. I'll be there as soon as I finish the crab pot. Keith said after the call, I have no choice but to work with these two. Let's just hope these assholes mean it. Josh is in Keith's position and started throwing crab pots here. South wind 90 miles on the south wind. It's only been 2 days since old Dan Halley sailed. I was looking for a crew at the docks. It took 2.5 weeks. The total quota for Harley this time is 30 tons. And this new crew is giving him a headache. Because this guy's first time at sea caused him to keep looking at the beach. I was knocked to the ground by the waves. Halley was so mad he wanted to get his hands on him. The crew then began the salvage operation. Harley is excited for the first crab pot of the year. Immediately, the harvest of crab pot water is obviously not good. Then the second cage was salvaged. The harvest is a little better. Then it's time to fish for crab pots and set them up. And so time quickly ran out. I know a crew member called out to Halley and said some crab pots weren't tied properly. Halley also woke up and asked the crew to correct. After all, if the crab pot wobbles, every crab pot that's tied down is going straight down. Soon Halley's idea came true and the waves hit. The untied crab pot is crooked. Even a little bit has a tendency to fall apart. The crew will go up when the storm slows down. But then a huge wave hit. Luckily, the crew took advantage of the gap to tie up some crab pots. So this wave didn't pose much of a danger. After seeing that the crew was all right, Hallie is going to teach the new crew how to tie a crab pot himself. Sure enough, the captain teaches seriousness. The crew soon learned a lesson. Then the crew went back to fishing for crab pots. At this point, the Harley above has found a place to drop, about 200 meters from where they're dropping it right now. Because the crab pot in this place is a little crab, so Hallie decided not to look. Just stay here and eat the minimum allowance. With the crab pot into the sea. View 310 miles southwest of the pad. The injured crew is doing fine. But Carl wouldn't let him work on deck. Carl said the doctor ordered 24-hour observation. So for the lives of the crew. I'm sure I didn't hear that. But the rest of the crew didn't. There are only 4 men left on deck. This makes their work stress multiplied. Then the crew began to salvage. Then the first crab came on board, and the harvest was not very good. Just one of them to sort through. And then there's the rotten crab pot. I don't know what caused it. The crew had to get things repaired first. It happened while the crew was getting their stuff. One of the crew accidentally sprained his ankle. The pain made him struggle to stand up. Carl up there heard the noise and went down to check. The ankle was observed to be abnormally swollen. Carl didn't see much of a problem. Not as much as it should be. Let him put his own ice on it. He said there were only 3 people left on deck, although neither of them is a big deal. But they have to get some rest. After all, the ship has lost 2 crew members in the past year. He can't risk the crew anymore. Then he tinkered with the map. The position he chose was the corner between 2 peaks. But we're going to have to give the crew a hard time. 240 miles northeast of the Thief. A rainbow appeared on the horizon at this time. Nathan and his wife are also silent in this beautiful scene. Nathan had a hunch that the rainbow would bring him good luck. So he decided he had to throw a cage here. The crew also began today's cage casting mission. The place he chose this time was a cliff of 1,800 meters. We're going to hang the crab pot on the cliff and put them in pairs together. Just after we dropped the crab pot, we picked up the radio from the Mary. Nothing. Just chatting with Nathan. And if Nathan saw any snow crabs. Keith must have heard those conversations too. He was still a little incredulous that the Mary hadn't found any crabs. And he couldn't believe the Mary had made contact with Thief. Keith felt betrayed. He decided to end it with Josh. He said cooperation is black and white. I can't believe these 2 got in trouble with themselves. Keith's lungs are bursting. He then led the crew to fish for crab pots. Fishing and doing calisthenics with the crew. Again, the crab god gave them a response. There were 55 after the first cage was sorted. Then began the second cage. Keith was so excited when this cage came up. After sorting, the number is as high as 70. When Keith saw the harvest, he had the crew throw cages. Some time later, Keith got a call. Hanging hair on the official Mary opposite. They told Keith about the crab pot. The largest cage has 16, but a total of 87 crabs were pulled from 22 crab cages. Keith almost didn't hold up with the grades. Then Keith started talking nonsense with a straight face. Looking down at the crabs. Keith says he usually harvests about 10. The smallest cage is even 6. They were a little suspicious, but there was nothing they could do. Then Keith said there were only 7 in the last cage. It's not that far off the actual 70. Doesn't that round up to 7? Keith couldn't keep up when he hung up. The view goes to the Mary. They're talking about going there. It wasn't long before Kathy realized. The Witcher's GPS says he's circling in circles. Josh came over when he heard Casey say that. And then they knew for sure that Keith was in the cage. They knew right away that Keith had filmed them. But they don't know why Keith lied to them. No, dude, you're calling Nathan. Not that there was much to ask. But if you 2 ask, it'll help. Keith wasn't just dumped by you 2. Finally, they decided to go to Keith's. Then the picture came to the south wind. They've started fishing for crab pots, too. Harley's still very focused on nurturing new people. Like now he lets the new guy watch the old crew throw the anchor hook up close. Hallie said he wanted to develop a team of young people. Follow the take-up, but the take-up machine suddenly stopped moving. Hallie's busy asking questions. The crew suspected a broken take-up, but you can't throw it away when you've got half the line back. So Hallie had his crew reel it in with a crane. Then the crew tied the line with chains. It's just going to be one piece at a time. There have been a few mishaps, but overall it's not a problem. The crew did a great job. But what's hard is the lack of feathers in the crab cage. After the crab pot is pulled out, the crew begins to repair it. 86 miles southwest of the thief. Nathan's fishing for yesterday's crab pot too. He feels the crab pot under the rainbow. The crew then began the salvage operation. As the take-up machine begins to exert force, it's not long before there's a big pile of it. Then the crab pot harvest can only be said to be normal. The crew sorted out a harvest of 13. It's not much, but Nathan's happy. After all, it was pulled from under the rainbow. Next came a bundle of thread. The crab pot is also on board and the harvest is good. There are 18 adult crabs after sorting. The crew went crazy. Nathan then ordered to continue the cage. After casting the crab pot, the crew went back to fishing. The third harvest was just shy of 11. The crew was happy despite the harvest. 236 miles southwest of the pad. Devin is the wounded man who vomited blood. Fine, Carl wants to go out and work. Carl didn't want him to go out. But I can't stop Devin from nagging me. Then Carl said he could go out. But if anything goes wrong, get back in time. At last, Devin went back to work on deck as he wished. Meanwhile, the crew on deck is preparing for the salvage. Everybody was so happy when Devin came out. After all, it takes a lot of pressure off someone else. Then the crew began fishing for crab pots. Carl says they're in the northernmost part of the Bering Sea, and he's pretty sure it's full of crabs. Run with the take-up machine. The crab pot aboard the boat is still full of crabs. The crew sorted out 36 crabs. The second cage close behind even had 43. The third harvest was not so good. There are only 28 crabs, but it's also twice as likely as happy boys. As more and more crabs come on board, the crew's enthusiasm for work is also growing. 320 miles northeast of the Marie, they arrived at Keith's cage and ordered the crew to pull out a cage for inspection. Josh said he was angry about the collaboration. Keith lied to himself in this way. Then the crab pot boarded the crab, really many. Josh was swearing 3 times in a row. And then I dropped the crab pot. Kathy called Keith. Keith got through at the same time. Casey came up here and told me about the crab pot. Keith was in over his head. Kathy repeated what she had just said. Keith didn't like it when he heard that. Just tell them about their contact with Nathan. Although they want to say something, but the evidence against Keith is overwhelming. Keith's immoral words will never come out of his mouth again. After the call, Josh said he would never work with Keith again. Then Casey tells the crew to drop the cage here, with the crab pot into the sea. The view goes to the pad. Their harvest has continued, and Devin, the wounded, is very motivated. This made Carl very happy. With the last of the crabs on board, Pat began her return voyage to unload. At this time, the South Windhorn has also repaired the take-up machine. Then the salvage mission began. Similarly, the first cage did not live up to their efforts. After sorting, we got 42 crabs. Pull off the Mary. They also depend on the bounty of Keith's seas. At the same time, Josh was teasing Nathan. Keith the old boy is immoral and all that. To the wizard, their crab pots are in bad shape. Keith said there were a lot of trouble for him. And that's the end of this video. Do you want to know what happened next? See the chart below for captain's earnings. How obvious the captain's attitude is to different bulls and horses. A man deserves to risk choking to death. Go to the engine room and repair the engine. All food needs to be warmed by the body. Women are different. Just a little skin on my hand. The crew will personally invite you to your room to rest. He took care of her wounds himself. I probably would have if I hadn't seen the original. The scene came to Dutch Harbor Airport. An old man walked slowly out of the airport. As soon as Old White arrived at the Northwest, he recruited men. Set sail as soon as the preparations are made. Then the picture goes to the thief. Today is Captain Nathan's birthday. His wife made Nathan some homemade cookies and a glass of hot milk. This is Nathan's birthday cake this year. Crab pots are being salvaged from the deck. Nathan stopped laughing when the crab pot came aboard. Happy birthday ruined by an empty crab pot. The second cage immediately after that also had nothing. Given the circumstances, Nathan is halfway through his quota. It will take a conservative 4 weeks to meet the quota. The crew on deck are half full of crab pots. So Nathan researched a new route. His favorite spot is called the Love Island Trenches. The depth is about 1,200 meters. This area has never been explored, so everything in there is pristine. Nathan thinks this place is really exciting. An hour later, the crab pot is almost ready. Nathan told the crew to come back and rest. Then he sailed to the trenches of Love Island. After arriving at the designated area, the crew began throwing crab pots. This time the rope was 1,600 meters long. It can be adapted to a maximum depth of 1,200 meters. Actually, Nathan's here for 2 reasons. One must be to fill their quota. The second is Nathan's cooperation with the Dutch port authorities. He's looking for some unknown creature or something. Just find one, and it'll bring Nathan tens of thousands of dollars. It's not a lot of money for Nathan, though, but you never think you have too much money. With the crab pot into the sea. To the northwest, 95 miles northwest. White's on the phone with Mandy right now. White told Mandy to get some rest. But Mandy says, "I'm restless." White's been doing it all the time anyway. Then Mandy asked about White's plan. Old White said his plan is similar to previous years. It's the same sandy spot from last year. The crew is now preparing for the launch. After hanging up the phone, the crew also baited the crab pots. Then the Old White came to inspect the deck. Needless to say, there's going to be a ceremony. Clark had already prepared herring for the crew. The crew had to go to the head in one go while the 2 men watched. Behind the crew again, under the crowd, to have another bite. This drove Old Bailey crazy. Finally, the Old White and the crowd hit a fist. After the ceremony, the spirits of the crew rose markedly. Even the work was happier than usual. 280 miles southeast of the port of Holland Harbor. They've just unloaded the cargo and are making preparations in the harbor. Anderson earned a total of $880,000 from the 2 landings. $34,000 per crew member. Another $30,000 in boat maintenance. Anderson's goal is $2.5 million. If we can't catch that number, Anderson's share of the legend. Sean's gonna take it all? Anderson just had a little time off. I could smell the faint smell of smoke. He wanted the photographer next to him to be sure. Inform the crew as soon as you're sure of your guess. Mason hurried down after receiving the notice. It's all done in the machine room. Mason was dazed by the smoke. Even the crew on deck can't stand the smoke. Mason came up with a smoking machine. The crew behind explained. The accident was caused by an aerodynamic clutch. It's probably just a tear in the top. The rotating parts inside are exposed to cold air. I guess that's what a sudden heat imbalance means. By this time, the smoke in the room was almost gone. Anderson also saw the full extent of the clutch burn. Mason came down below to begin repairs. Anderson said if this thing catches fire, the smoke produced is very harmful to human health, and this fire can't be put out with water. Let this fire burn and the ship will crash. At this point, Mason came to report. Mason said he just replaced a burned-out generator. Cut the power to the clutch again. Could have an impact on the ship's power. But it's not a problem. I can fix the clutch in no time. After learning that the ship was safe, Anderson gave orders to go out and catch fish. The Winona, 223 miles northeast. They now harvest one in a cage. The old sow opened my eyes in the tree. Sean, since the beginning of this quarter, we've searched this area for nearly 1,000 miles. But just over 100,000 crabs were caught. Let's be honest, it's $30,000 for gas. Goodbye itself bought 350,000 king crab allotment. Well, that's all Shane has left at this point. Then the crab pot is loaded with starfish. From ear to ear, they picked out 2 crabs. The subsequent second harvest was not good. And then Sean's wife called. The wife held the baby and talked to Sean. The wife is most concerned about the harvest. Sean said the crop was very weak, and they don't know where to catch crabs. My wife suggested we take a look at my father's crabbing route. Sean thought it was a good idea, too. Hang up the phone and look down at the dismal harvest. Look at my father's picture again. Sean seemed to have made up his mind, so he decided to follow the example of his elders. Toss the crab pot into shallow water. After informing the crew of their plans, the crew began throwing crab pots. Then the rainbow appeared on the horizon, as if to confirm their harvest. 310 miles northwest of the thief. The crew is ready for the salvage. Nathan set a crab pot of this depth. He was sure that no boat had picked it up, and this crab pot is estimated to take 36 minutes. The crew is excited about the challenge. As Nathan gave the order, the crew began to salvage. Rotate slowly with the take-up machine. Nathan wondered if he'd ever catch a fantastical species, like some sea monkeys, dragons, or something. By the end, Nathan was so nervous he covered his face. But Nathan finally stuck his head out. The crab pot is full of crabs. Dude, what are you expecting? It's a documentary. Then the second cage was another harvest. The number of the two most red cages reached 38. Most of the crabs caught are adults. After all, a crab can't survive such high water pressure. To see such a good harvest, Nathan immediately let the crew increase the amount. 90 miles northwest of the northwest. Old White, and they're also fishing crab pot time. There are at most 3 weeks left before the takeover is halted. Old White must seize this limited time. Meet your quota worth $90,000. Turn with the take-up machine. Old White's heart was in his mouth. Very good. There's nothing in this cage. I was wrong. There's a crab baby in there. Old White to the result is really dare, not compliment. The crew then resumed the salvage. Old White said this is the bad harvest. It's impossible to finish it in 3 weeks. The second boat also has no hair. Oh, and there's a little crab in this cage too. The crew continued the salvage. The third cage also has nothing. Then there are 2 crabs in the fourth cage. But this crab is really a crotch. Old White can only comfort themselves, at least not a no. Then White started praising Clark. He bobbed and bobbed for nearly half a minute. Old White praised after the sorting crab Clark up. When Clark came up, White showed him the chart and let him speak his mind. Clark said he had a feeling something might be up north. If he's on his own, go back north. He said he was sure to find big crabs there. I don't think White's got it figured out, but he was looking at Clark so hard. Choose to believe him for once, and said to go north to a sandy area. As time goes by, arriving at the designated position, the crew begins to cast the cage. 234 miles northeast of the Legend. Since Anderson was on his way back to port, the crab pot was dropped in this area, and this crab pot can be soaked for 2 days. The depth of the crab pots is 600 meters. He needs to do it before his shares are taken away. A lot of fish to bet the shareholders, while the crew below is packing up. Then the crew began to salvage, and the crew wanted Anderson to catch his quota. Anderson's a nice guy. After all, what if a different captain didn't know? Force with take-up machine. The crab pot is not on board the crew's frustration first. At first glance, there are few fish in this crab cage. The dogs shook their heads when they saw this harvest. Then the second cage was salvaged. This second cage doesn't even have a fish. The crew looks like leaking gas balls. Those boaters are all gasping for air. It's exhausting to carry a crab pot. Then began to fish the next cage. Again, no chicken feathers. And then the accidents will happen. The crew looked at Cheyenne in confusion. Anderson asked Cheyenne what's going on. Cheyenne held out her hand as she walked back. Then we heard from the crew that Cheyenne had cut her hand. Anderson was confused again. Cheyenne's hands began to squirt with blood. Then Cheyenne came by the sink to stop the bleeding. If you don't say it's bleeding, I thought it was a murder scene. When Cheyenne got hurt, he was going to cut the rope. Turns out one of them didn't have a good grip on the dry hand. The crew then brought medical cotton cloth to bandage Cheyenne. Cheyenne came to Anderson after the dressing was done. Boy, such a small wound. How could there be so much blood? Anderson told Cheyenne to stay here after he saw it. You're not going anywhere. Anderson doesn't want to see his niece suffer. Anderson then went to help Cheyenne deal with it himself. Disinfect with iodine after washing with soap, and then you put it on with super glue. Anderson said it was invented at second station. It'll cover the wound so it doesn't get infected. I didn't know Anderson was so careful. Look at the deck, and the harvest is terrible. Anderson said he was understaffed. But now we have to find something else. I have no choice but to make the crew suffer more. The Winona, 250 miles northeast. Sean was holding his father's watch. Said it was his lucky charm. This will surely bring you good luck. The crew then began the salvage operation. Sean said he was in a 7-mile channel. The cage is only 75 meters deep. This time Sean's crabbing is a break from his usual routine. But he trusted his father to protect him. Let yourself catch the remaining 22 tons of quota. Then there are a lot of crabs on board the crab pot. The crew sorted and got 14. Boy, that's a pretty good crop. The second pot that followed was not bad either. The crab is all shiny and shiny. A third cage followed with 22 animals. That's a good shot in the arm for Sean. After all, this is the first time he's had more than 20 in a cage. And the crew was thrilled. 380 miles northwest. White is now explaining Clark's thoughts. He said Clark's choice wasn't very deep, but geography has its advantages. There may be a good harvest of seaweed here. Then White called Clark up. When he got to the cab, White asked Clark if he could drive. Clark says a little, but not much. Then the old White directly taught the right to drive out. Clark was captain of the ship, and old White crewed for him. Then old White went to put on his raincoat. The crew cheered for old White as soon as they reached the deck. The crabs can't be caught, but the atmosphere must be in place. The crew even gave up their anchor hooks to White. After all, you've been a captain for decades. Old White put out his head and began to look at the crab pot. With the crab pot on board good guy this harvest. After sorting 44 big crabs, then old White threw the anchor hook again. So happy for Clark up there, and said old White looks not weak with 18-year-old guy. Then the old White continued to salvage. The second cage got on board with the same bounty. After sorting, we got 34 big crabs. Clark couldn't be happier. After all, the more crabs he has, the sooner he'll see Mandy. 260 miles southeast of the Legend. Cheyenne can't go on deck because of a cut on her hand. So there are only 4 crew members on deck. Their stress is evident, despite the discontent of the crew. But it was all squashed by Anderson, who had his hands full. Then the crew began to salvage. Good for the first cod of the day. After sorting, we got 137 cod. With the second cage of cod on board, Cheyenne also asked to go back on deck. Anderson won't let him, but Cheyenne won't talk to him. Then Cheyenne put on her gear. Back on deck, the crew praised their toughness. Then Anderson said he disobeyed his own orders. She really is her own niece. Then the crab pot is also rich. There are 220 sorted in this cage, surpassing their season high. Come aboard the Northwest. For the first time, strict White praised Clark. It makes Clark happy. There's a harvest on the Thief. Nathan was glad they caught the crabs too. The crew was more than happy. Aboard the Winona, Sean and the crew light fireworks to celebrate the harvest his father brought them. And that's the end of this video. Do you want to know what happened next? See the chart for the captain's earnings.